And in that consciousness of healing, are you ready to be free?
Oh, yes.
You sure?
Yes.
Well, name it and claim it, know it and grow it, and watch out. Take a deep breath. We're going to do our treatment for freedom together aloud. I speak my word for myself, my center, and all its members and friends. I know love as the only reality. I am created out of love. Love is what I am. I know this love as absolute freedom in every area of my life, the life of my center, and all who call it home. I know our center's mortgages are paid in full, and I claim for all of us financial freedom with all debts paid and cleared. I release any sense of struggle or wrongdoing. I live in an abundant universe where there is more than enough for all. We experience freedom in every moment by always having more than enough money, vibrant health, and loving relationships. We are who we have come here to be. With hearts open wide, we see the world through the eyes of love. We are blessed, we are rich, and we are free, and so it is. And we use our points of power. I always pay attention. I always tell the truth and tell it quickly. I always ask for what I want when I want it. I always take total responsibility for my experience. I always keep my agreements. And so it is. Yay!
Thank you, Barbara. Oh, look, you got me again. This is not because Barbara is overly generous in sharing the stage. It's because I'm going to be gone the next 3 weeks. And I appreciate that because I really love to talk to you and tell you about things. So, because I'm going to be going out to California, I've been thinking a lot about Ernest Holmes. There's the anniversary of the founding of a community in California, in the city of Whittier, where I'll be the keynote speaker for their 60-year anniversary. And I'm very excited about that, and I'll explain why here in a little bit. This thing about Ernest Holmes, you know, normally you come here and the first thing you see is a quote from Dr. Holmes. And we talk about Holmes all the time, but we don't talk about him. We talk about his teachings, the things that he created for us. Now, he was not an original thinker. He was someone who synthesized the thoughts of many great philosophers and thinkers throughout the ages. But he put it together really well, and we really appreciate that. And this idea of who he was in the world is something that most of us don't think about. Even though we follow these teachings and we live by them, who he was as a man is something that isn't normally a conversation at the center. So I thought today would be a good day to talk about who he was and where he got his basic ideas that created this thing called the science of mind. You all know this book, right? Yeah. I think it's in its 47th printing, and it will continue to be around for, I'm sure, a very long time. This is the book that teaches the principles of science of mind. But Holmes had a lot of other books. My absolute favorite is this thing called You. This is the book where he practices what he teaches us in the science of mind, where he speaks it so clearly and so beautifully. The man, with all the things that he was also a poet. And this is just an amazing treasure trove. And I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful just to share a little bit of it? So what came to me was, actually, Barbara and I share this. I share from one book, she shares from this one currently. And this is what just popped up this week. If you can see beauty instead of ugliness, beauty will appear. Cease weeping over the mistakes of yesterday and steadfastly behold the face of the great and divine reality. Walk in that light wherein there is no darkness. Say, I know that every negative condition of the past is swept aside. I refuse to see it or to think about it. Yesterday is no longer here. Tomorrow has not yet arrived. Today is God's day. God's day is my day. Today, bright with hope and filled with promise, is mine. Today, my heart is without fear. I have implicit confidence in the good and enduring and the true. Today, I shall guard my thought and speech. I shall keep my consciousness steadfast with the realization that there is a spiritual power upon which I may always rely. I shall turn resolutely to the divine source which knows no confusion, to that spiritual center which has no fear. The Spirit is not afraid of anything. The divine has no enemies. The Spirit knows no opposites. Consciously, I draw close to my divine center, the source of all that is. I feel the warmth in its presence. I enter into a faith made perfect through love and confidence, an assurance made complete by the abandonment of myself to good. Acknowledging good is all in all my ways, desiring only the good for others, I rest in calm assurance. I open my consciousness to the realization that all the power and presence there is clothes me in its eternal embrace, that the Spirit forever imparts its life to me. I believe in myself because I believe in God. I believe in my destiny because I know that the law of good is operating through me. I have confidence in the future, an enthusiastic expectation of good things to come. Therefore, I accept the fullness of my life in this moment. Wow. Could we all live like that and know that truth? That's the essence of Ernest Holmes. That's what he brings us. And he wrote lots of other books. If you read that article about Robert Brown, you'll see that he wrote a book called It's Up to You. Simple little book. But Robert Brown, as a young man, as a 12-year-old, began reading that over and over and over again and turned his life into a major impact on the world with dear and close friends and advisors to presidents, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela. This man, Robert Brown, made a true difference in the world, and he gives credit to his grandmother that loved him and supported him, and to that book by Ernest Holmes. When I brought the idea of doing an article in Science of Mind magazine to him, I said, "So, do you know what the science of mind is?" He said, "No." I said, "Okay, do you have any sense that Holmes had any kind of organization around him?" "No. I just know I love that little book." How many other people in the world have been touched by Ernest Holmes and have no idea who he is because they picked a book up somewhere? A man named Taniguchi picked up his brother's book, Fenwick's book, one of the books his brother wrote in Japan in a used bookstore, and built an organization of millions of followers based on this teaching. Amazing what can happen. So I want to tell you about Ernest Holmes today and about what influenced his life. He was born in 1887 up in Maine on a farm, very rural environment. When he was 18, now he was always inquisitive. His nickname when he was a kid was question mark. Because he always had some question. His family was Baptist, but his father had no tolerance for judgment and the idea of hell. So he grew up thinking learning from his dad that there was no hell, and took that into his way of seeing the world. When he was 18, he moved to Boston. He decided he wanted to learn about public speaking, so he took a class. And the teacher of that class was a Christian Scientist, and this was Boston, at the time. And so Mary Baker Eddy's church, Christian Science, was headquartered there. The mother church was in Boston. And he peripherally looked at it, but he never joined. He did read Mary Baker Eddy's writing, and I think he probably got the idea of practitioners from them, but he never became a member. It was his own study and work that really created the philosophy of science of mind. And he had he had a fourth one later in his life, but three major influences in his personal studies. The first one, there it is, came from Ralph Waldo Emerson. He read Emerson over and over and over again and said, this is something, he said it made his heart sing. And these are the words that he spoke of about Emerson. It's not that God has a purpose for us, but that you and I have a purpose in God. You can't escape the fact that you're here. Something has to be done, and you are the only one that can do anything about it. That was the essence of Emerson, and that's what he embraced, realizing that even though he never saw himself as a great spiritual leader, he said, I have things to do. I have things to understand, and I have work to do that understanding. So he took on this, very seriously studying this work. Not long after that, he moved to California to live with his brother. He lived in Venice, which is a part of a beach along the Los Angeles area coast. And he and his brother lived there. That was in 1916 that he lived there with his brother. And that's when he and his brother found another great teacher, and that was Judge Thomas Troward. And here's a quote. This is what he had to say about Troward. The thing I like about Troward is that he gives a scientific or logical explanation of whatever he claims. Take the idea of unity. He quotes from the ancient teachers of India saying that it is impossible to have two infinites. For if there were two, neither of them would be infinite. Therefore, there is only one. Is that not logical?
Yes.
I think probably Troward said it longer than that. But Holmes was able to synthesize these teachings and make them work, make them apply to life. That was his great gift. So, yes, he wrote, but he also spoke. And the story of him speaking is very interesting. His job in Venice was that he worked in a rec center. He was the purchasing agent. And he had a little office, and he kept some of his metaphysical books there. And a guy that would visit his office saw those and asked about it. And Holmes lent him books to read. And then this fellow invited him to come speak. And what a lovely opportunity to come speak in his home, which he did. And it was a great experience, and the people that were loved it. And so he started being invited to speak at places all around Los Angeles. At one point, he said, I need to pursue this as more of a vocation than just doing it casually, because the people he was speaking at Holmes weren't actually paying him. So what he decided to do, he went to a metaphysical library in the Los Angeles area, and he rented their little space in there to do a class. His very first class, he rented the space for $1. And he charged everybody that came 25 cents. This was in 1917. That's why it was so small. And he spoke. There were 15 people that came. Several of them asked for treatment afterwards, so he charged them something for this. And for the effort that night, he made $5. Yeah, I know. You got to start somewhere, right? That was enough to make him realize that he could actually do this for a living. What happened within a year of that is that his brother, who was a minister in Los Angeles, quit his job, and the two of them opened an office in Los Angeles where they did treatment work for people, where they wrote, and they did write. They put out a book in a year, and this thing called You was no, it wasn't. What was the first book? Creative Mind, exactly. Thank you, Barbara. Creative Mind was his first book, and then Fenwick put a book out that same time. And that was called The Law of Mind and Action. They both, over the next 40 years, were reprinted 20 times. Very, very successful books. At the same time, Ernest was asked to officiate a wedding, but he wasn't a minister. He never had any formal ministerial training. But he had some friends over at the Divine Science Church. So he went over and asked them if they'd consider ordaining him. And they looked at what he was doing, and they said, yes, we will ordain you into ministry. And that's how he got his ordination. Sound familiar? Terry, ordain me. So that was what got him to the level of actually working as a public speaker, teaching metaphysics throughout the Los Angeles area. At one point, he went back east and to do some appearances and such. And in the process of that, he had the opportunity to work with Emma Curtis Hopkins, who was his third great influence. And here's what Emma brought him. The woman was 80 years old when they worked together. He was her last official student. She had worked with the folks from Unity, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, and the Brooks sisters with Divine Science. But at 80, Holmes spent a year working with Emma Curtis Hopkins, and what he learned from her was mysticism. See, he had all this logic from Troward and all of this personal growth ideas from Emerson, but he needed the mysticism to understand that within himself he could be attuned to the presence of the divine, and that it wasn't a mysticism that was unreachable. He realized that anybody could do it, and that we all had that divine connection. And so he built that into his philosophy and his way of seeing the world. And that really rounded out everything that he was doing. After he did that, he came back to California, and he did some amazing things in 1927. That was a big year for him. He founded the Institute of Religious Science and School of Philosophy, and he opened an office on Wilshire Boulevard where he did classes. He launched a monthly magazine called The Science of Mind in 1927, and he married the love of his life, Hazel. Let's see, talking about his school, about what he did, he didn't see this thing as a church. He believed it was a teaching institute. So he recruited some amazing people, professors at the University of Southern California, USC, and University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. And they came and with him taught classes. I learned some of the classes. They were in philosophy, religion, psychology, metaphysics, human relations, creative thinking, and parapsychology. Those were the things taught at the Institute early on. And it became very popular, and there were many, many students. And it was a very successful to where they actually had quite a big building where they did these classes on a regular basis. His mother, Anna, moved from the New England area to California and became a great practitioner in the movement. And so did Hazel. And everyone around him was actually growing. And by then he was speaking at the Wiltern Theater, and which sat almost 3,000 people, and he would pack it on Sunday morning. There was no music, there was nothing else. He just came up and lectured for an hour, and he did that regularly. Now he had learned to do that well, because when he and Fenwick first started their work together, they were each speaking about 15 times a week. So I can't wait to tell some of my colleagues that complained about having to do Sunday in one class. But what he had, people wanted. And it really made a difference in their lives. Then some of his students wanted to start extensions, which were called chapters of the Institute. A number of them were actually ministers that were ordained in other faiths, but they were captivated by this thing called the Science of Mind. And so they started opening these chapters. After a while, they came to Ernest and said, we want to turn these chapters into churches. And Ernest was leery of this idea of church. But he said, okay, we'll give it a go. And they did, they started. So that by 1953, there were 69 churches in the religious science movement. Could be. All right, we handled that quick. Oh, by the way, if you've got your phone, make sure you get a good picture of me today so that you can put it on Facebook. And then all your friends hear about me talking about Ernest Holmes. It was in 1943 that they had 18 of those churches, and 20 practitioners were working at the Institute. In 49, he started his radio show. I think I've got a picture of that. Actually, this was the piece by Emma. Let me read you this real quick. I learned that mysticism is not something to fear, but rather it was a deeper spiritual philosophy of life. Anyone can be in direct contact with the infinite presence by becoming still and listening to his inner voice. Everybody was a his back then, so don't take it personal. That just gives you a kind of idea of what life was like when Ernest was around. His radio show, 1943, this thing called Life began broadcasting. It was a great success. You actually can listen to some of those recordings on our website. Yeah. So important things were happening. It was in 1953, there were 69 churches established all across North America. And there was an interdisagreement within the organization. Some of these ministers didn't like the way things were being handled, and I'm not going to go into the details of that, but it was in January of 1953 when the organization split into two factions. The majority of them stayed with Holmes, but 16 pretty powerful ministers went off and started the Institute. What was it called? It was before it was RSI. It was the International Association of Religious Science Churches. And then they shortened that to Religious Science International a few years later. And so you've got these two that grew simultaneously. And then what's important about that, of course, is that 5 years ago we stopped all that nonsense and brought everybody back together. And I'm so grateful for having all of that. And one other thing that I want to tell you about is that 60 years ago, when dedicating a church in Whittier, California, Ernest Holmes was asked to come and speak. The recording of it was not well done. It was just done with a little device sitting on the lectern. But he got up and spoke to the people in Whittier and had what is known as his moment of illumination. And it profoundly impacted him. And I think it's this amazing thing that took him to a total grander understanding of this thing called life. Anybody who's anybody in this movement knows that he had that experience and that it was extremely mystical. And many of you have had some of you may have had the opportunity to hear this. I actually heard it in a recording from the man who actually introduced Dr. Holmes that night. His name was Bill Hart. At the time, he was the president of the board of this new church in Whittier, which happened to be called Christ Church of Religious Science. Go figure. It's now called Harmony Center for Spiritual Living, but at the time, that's what it was called. And Bill Hart was the introducer of Dr. Holmes that night. When I knew him, Dr. Bill Hart was the interim minister in Miami after Barbara and her then husband Tony left that church. The United organization brought in Bill Hart, and I was the administrator, and I had the great pleasure and honor of working with him. He said, "Have you heard the recording?" No, didn't even know there was one. Didn't know about the incident at all. He said, "Well, let's go sit down." And he pulled out a lower recorder and he let me listen to it. It's an awful recording. But if you can listen past all the scratchiness and all the, the fact that it's just not high quality, it's amazing. So we're going to play about 6 minutes of that for you. All right, so you can say you heard this. So listen past. If you don't understand a word or two, just let it go and keep listening, and you'll be astonished. Let's do it. Thank you.
We haven't yet done what I believe we can do with our membership. Now I really want to dedicate a church. And this is really, I think beautiful. I think wonderful. I think a miracle. But I know why we're here. It's here because you're here. And because Dr. Ernest Smith is here. And because your contribution very little bills, while you want to speak around here, have clicked together. And what happened? Power like the weaving of the rope. There one friend goes away. But united, it will always be this way. We are met today. What the outside consciousness of a church body can do if the happy brain, if they are trying to exercise the authority over them, not because people I would be a neighbor anyway. Not of that private lives with their own business but their own. But on one day only. There is a law of wind. There is a power in the universe living in our and we can use it. And it will multiply. It affects 1,000 times in my years. Here the United Countries in you. I have had so much inward conviction about this the last year as the United Countries in Normandy that I know, as I know that I am here, that you are here, under the leadership of your most inspired leader. We are drawn to you in the divine equation for the God of man you have on earth. You are going to do it. I will. I know that you will, because of what happened here. Let me tell you it. It is the only issue we have. There are many wonderful religions in the world. We are not better than the others. We are not more spiritual. We are not more evolved. We are not more anything. I have only one thing. We have co-joined our consciousness with the eternal virtue of the universe, that everlasting and eternal power of all life, and the mother of all creation forever beginning to be begotten. There is beginning in the night, right now. And that the word of our mouth is the word of truth, in such the year of emulation of body, the truth which sanctifies the word which he said are really not only the sick, but the poor in heart. We are dedicated to the concept that the pure in heart shall see of. Yes, that only your adventure now, that one with truth is the mountain that every one of us in the secret place of the Most High, the symbol of his own consciousness, has the secret of the eternal, the everlasting, the almighty, and the ineffable. God and I are one. I feel in this. And I feel like one great in praise, one great in effort, one crescendo song, and one developing like a consciousness. I feel it. God, the veil is in you, mingle with the hosts of heaven. I see it, and I can speak no more.
Wow. I see it. I shall speak no more. So what I'd like you to take from this is that we have an amazing philosophy. We understand there is a law that we impress our thoughts upon. But there's so much more going on. It's mystical, and our task always is to be in that presence of the divine as clearly as we can, as humbly as we can, as beautifully as we can. Because life is just that way. It's a mystical road. And our founder demonstrated that for us. So we continue on the path to do what is ours to do. And we are blessed to know that the presence of the divine is something for us to continue to seek out in our lives, and it will reveal itself. It always will. Whew. Thank you, good teacher.